Hello again. So this is going to be the respiratory system, following right up on the digestive system that we just finished. Um, let's see, and this is actually take number 2. The first one just did not go very well. I quit in the middle, and a fresh cup of tea has been procured, and I'm going to try again. So just, it doesn't always work the first time. Here's the digestive system that we worked on earlier, and part of that I took that and I just enlarged it. So if you're if drawing digitally, it's a fine place to start. Um, so let's see, let's get a new layer and let's start in. And where to begin? Let's start at the top. So let me get our list up as well, because I know there's specific things on our list that we need to have. And the first one's the nasal cavity, and we talked about this during the digestive system just slightly. That the nasal cavity is this area, obviously coming off of your nose, coming down into the nostrils. So here's our nasal cavity. And the nasal cavity becomes this area here in the throat called the nasopharynx. And we talked about that a little bit during the digestive system. And then we have this area here called the oral cavity. And the oral cavity, I'm going to change the color slightly. The oral cavity is your mouth, of course, and we're going to include the tongue here in this drawing of the oral cavity to give us a little idea of where we're at. And then this is the roof of your mouth, the hard palate and the soft palate. Alright, so the tongue. And coming down into here, so we have the, we'll just label these again. Nasopharynx. And then we have in the mouth area, the oropharynx. Whoops. Below that, we come down into this area. I'm going to go back into the blue. You have the lower area called hypopharynx. Hypo means low, like hypothermia. And again, not terms you need to memorize by any means, just stuff to know. And then down here in the hypopharynx, we have this area where your vocal cords are, called the larynx. And we can relabel that, oral cavity. Alright, we're all labeled up. We're caught up with the labels. In the digestive system, we had coming down, we had the esophagus. In the respiratory system, this is going to split off. We're going to move this esophagus just slightly here. And it's going to split, and you're going to have a split between the esophagus and the trachea. So they're kind of combined in here, and then they split off into their own separate tubes. So this is going to be our trachea. And of course, here's the esophagus coming down. And the trachea is going to sit in front of the esophagus, and we'll look at why. We'll look at why here in a second. It's kind of cool. And the trachea is going to come down, and it's going to split into a right and a left bronchus. And we'll look at that more in a second. So it comes down here and it splits. So the trachea. Where do I want to go next with this? Let's stay up here in the throat for a second. You have another thing up here in your throat called the epiglottis. And the epiglottis is this flap right here. And it's kind of a really cool, looking piece of anatomy. If you look at it from the back view, it almost looks like a leaf. It's kind of cool like that. But what the epiglottis does, so now we've got this dual passageway where we need food to go one channel and we need air to go the other channel. And if we take our food and put it down into the trachea, we of course choke. Not a good thing. But what happens with the epiglottis is when you swallow, this epiglottis flaps open into this position, into this position, and seals off the trachea, so food can't get down in there, which is kind of neat. So every time you swallow, this flap closes, and the chewed up food's called a bolus. The bolus of food can then make its way safely past the trachea down into the esophagus. This is what happens when people are laughing hard and they're eating at the same time, and they take a big gasp of breath right as they're swallowing, and as the air is going in, the epiglottis cannot flap shut, and then they choke. So don't have any fun while you're eating. That's just moral of this story, I guess. Glottis. So there's your epiglottis. I just think it's one of the really, really cool things. And this is an aside. Infants, they can breastfeed and they can breathe at the same time. If you've ever seen an infant breastfeed, they just keep sucking in, they keep breathing, and that the epiglottis in the infant is much higher, and the way it seals off, that the milk can actually go around it while they breathe and flow down into the esophagus. It's kind of fascinating. I did I did some drawings on it, and it was just really fun to study. Let me get that out of there. But the descent of the epiglottis, there's a whole paper written about it. So if you're into stuff like that, look it up. Okay, so the trachea, we're on the trachea. The trachea, so again, the trachea is in front of the esophagus, and so we can see it here. So as we swallow, these two can press right against each other, and the trachea itself is actually it's a tube-like structure, obviously, and it's got this cartilage that wraps around it. Only it doesn't go all the way around. It kind of wraps around the front and partially around to the back. There's a good one. All right, just go with that. You get the idea. And what this does is it holds the trachea open. And it's in front of the esophagus, and it allows the back of it to be able to compress. So if you think if you swallowed a very large bolus of food, the epiglottis then kind of blocked off the trachea, so you can't not swallowing anything while you're eating. And then that also, the trachea, the backside, as the esophagus can come here, if you can imagine, and the food, if the bolus of food is large, it can, instead of getting stuck behind a piece of cartilage on the trachea, which would be, terrible, it can be flexible on the back and allow a large bolus of food to pass through, which is kind of cool. So it has this cartilage. It has this cartilage on it, which is kind of neat. And again, that's a fun one to draw too. But back to what we were doing over here. Let's add a new layer, and get to the lungs. So for the lungs, I'm just going to put the symmetry back on for a second. Center it here on the body-ish. And when we start to talk about the lungs, we talk briefly about the diaphragm, which is kind of a muscular wall that separates the thoracic cavity, so the upper portion, from the abdominal cavity. It has some holes in it, one for the esophagus to go through, one for the thoracic aorta to turn, the descending aorta to turn into the abdominal aorta, so for the aorta to go through, and then the inferior vena cava to come up through. So it's got a few holes in it, which can cause some interesting problems in and of themselves, but I digress. So anyhow, the lungs sit on top of the diaphragm, and they're shaped sort of like this. I might go a little bit. All right. And the lungs are different on each side, so I've drawn them the same. We'll get this symmetry off here and fix this here. On the left side, your lungs have kind of a cutout. So here's the front of the lung, which would make this is the back side. We're seeing, it's a three-dimensional structure, obviously. We're seeing it. So it has this cutout, and this cutout allows the heart to sit in here, and we'll add that in just a couple minutes. And then each lung has various lobes. The right lung, again, not our right as we're drawing, but the patient's right as we're drawing from that point of view, has three lobes: the superior, the middle, and the inferior lobe. And the left lung has just two lobes. It has the superior and the inferior lobe. So that's kind of where we're at with the heart. And again, this is going to be behind. That's the back side that we're looking at. So there's a notch cut out, which is kind of neat. And we'll get onto the heart in just a second. Coming off of the trachea, you have the bronchus. So you have a left bronchus and a right bronchus, and this would be the right bronchus. And of course, this would make that one the left. And the right bronchus actually exits off a little bit higher than the left bronchus, which means that when people choke, if it gets all the way down here, it's often lodged in the right bronchus. Those go into the lungs and they split into this tree-like formation, very similar to the blood vessels that we drew previously when we did the kidneys. Into the bronchioles. Sorry, tea break there for a second. Bronchioles. And then these, of course, they'll split even further until eventually ending up into these little pockets, which are often drawn as these little balls called the alveoli. And the alveoli are not actually little balls, which I find is really interesting, even though they get drawn like that all the time. They're actually little air pockets. So if you think about a sponge, I guess. If you look at a sponge and you look at the holes, or a piece of Swiss cheese, and you look at the holes in the cheese or the sponge, the empty space are the alveolus. So bronchus, then these are the bronchioles, Chiole, bronchioles, and then the alveoli is Alveoleus, alveolus, alveoli. plural? Alveoli. Alveoli is singular? Alveolus. I don't know. I have to look it up. Anyhow, I hate it when I even start thoughts like that. Anyhow, so the empty pockets are the alveoli. And then if you think about it, that we're down on a very microscopic level now, and that the capillary beds flow through here, and this is where the oxygen exchange occurs. So if you think about the probably should actually do it in that purple color, because you have oxygenated and deoxygenated blood swapping places in here, as the and we'll get to the blood supply next, as the blood supply goes through the lungs. So you breathe in the carbon dioxide, it comes in and it swaps it out for the fresh oxygen. So that's that, and let's put a new layer on here again and talk about that blood supply, since we seem to be there. The heart sits kind of here in the middle of your chest. Right. And we'll get to the circulatory system soon, and we'll talk more about the heart in detail. And you have these, the pulmonary arteries and the pulmonary veins that come off of the heart, and they go into the lungs, which is where the blood supply shifts from deoxygenated to oxygenated. That's not what I wanted. I wanted the eraser, because that's going to be behind there, so we'll just erase part of it. You get the idea. So there's your heart. It's tucked back. Well, it's not actually there. It's tucked back in here. And what that looks like actually is, if you kind of draw the lung a little bit differently, if we looked at it from, let's say, almost the side 3/4 view, if here's our lung and here's the cutout. Get rid of that. You get this kind of thing going on, and that the heart sits tucked down in here, that the blood vessels enter both lungs this way. Pardon me. Enter here to an area called the hilum. So then, and the blood supply runs all through the lungs and the capillary beds, and that's again up here where all that oxygen exchange takes place. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to tell you about that. There probably is. I can't remember it right now. I don't think there is, actually. I've covered everything on our list, I believe. So again, about 20 minutes. I'm happy with that. And these are going to be when we get into our last project, where you're doing the anatomical character dissection, and you're going to have to take your cartoon and whoever your cartoon creature is, and then modify all these body systems to fit within that cartoon. And you'll need to know all these parts so you can properly draw that. So anyhow, good stuff, and I hope you guys have a great week. I will see you next Thursday.